So the next step is, how do we decide on what a pay structure should look like so that we can ensure that it is fair, so that we can ensure that there's both internal and what we call external equity, and I'll get into that in a moment, and that it is in compliance with the law, both employment laws and labor laws, making sure that we're paying people the same for the same job. And so our pay structure is how we decide how much money each job is worth to the organization and that they are willing to pay for that job. Each job then has a set of what we call compensable factors, and in those compensable factors we make the determination that a certain skill at a certain level is worth a certain amount of money in terms of pay. What does internal equity mean? Well, it means within the organization that lower paying jobs should have lower skill requirements and higher paying jobs have higher skill requirements, and that they need to be proportional from lowest to highest in the organization. It should be a pretty strong line, a strong pay line, and that the more value the job has, the more difficult the job is, the more point values it has, the higher the pay you would get. And that's how we ensure that no matter what the job is, as long as we're looking at what we call the compensable factors, the elements of the job that are being paid for at a certain rate, that the lower level gets a lower pay and a higher level expectation is gets a higher pay. So your job structure is also called a job hierarchy, whatever, it doesn't matter. They both get at the same thing. And the idea of a hierarchy is that there's lower levels and upper levels, and lower levels have lower pay and lower skill needed, and higher levels have higher pay and higher skill levels needed. And so they might need the same skill, but for some jobs, it's a very low level of knowledge that's needed to do it, whereas the same skill set might be required at higher levels for a different job. And so the expectation is that we need to set up our pay levels based on the worth of the job to the company and what it should be paid. And there's many tools that we can use to determine that worth and how that's set up. So the method that we use to determine the value of the job to the company, which then in turn determines what that job's base pay will be, because base pay is not about the person. Base pay is about the job. So the job requires a certain salary, and then individuals may get more than that if they're better performers, right? If they negotiate differently, if there's market pressures and those kinds of things, which we won't get into for this point. But the most important thing is knowing that when we determine base pay, it's base pay about the job or a class of jobs, and pay for performance is about pay for the individual for the difference in performance that they engage in. So let's start with talking about job evaluation, and there's different methods. The simplest method is a ranking method, and whether we rank it, compare it to all other jobs, and make a determination that, for a smaller business that only has a handful of jobs, these jobs are more important, this is what the hierarchy looks like, and this is what you should get paid. Now the challenge with a ranking method is we can determine that job A should be paid more than job B, but what the ranking method doesn't tell us is how much more the ranking method they should make based on that ranking method. So we have enough to know that there should be differences in pay, but we don't have enough to tell us how much more or less somebody should make, a job should demand when you just have the ranking method. All right, so that's a big issue. And usually subject matter experts look at the jobs, they make a determination about what is the order of relative contribution and relative importance to the organization. The classification method is much more of a narrative approach, where we look at job descriptions and we look at the narrative that supports those job descriptions, and we determine based on the narrative, based on what that job description is, that this has key this requires higher skill than this job by reading what the job descriptions say only. And it's really just a written classification, a narrative, a qualitative analysis, if you will. Then we have the point factor, where we look at weights. Now, when we're getting at the point factors, now we're taking what was a ranking method and we're looking at what we call compensable factors. And those compensable factors determine how much people should get paid. And so let's say the job is broken down into maybe 5 compensable factors that they have to have: how difficult the job is, how much education they need and education they need or training they need to do the job, how difficult the job is, and what kind of working conditions there are. There's a bunch of different ones. Let's say we believe that the educational level or the skill level that they need to have is weighted the highest, and then maybe next would be the working conditions, and that would also be an important thing, because let's say that the job requires me to work outdoors in the heat where it's 100 degrees, or the job requires me to work in a refrigerated unit where it might be 40 degrees. I need to pay people for that hardship, because that is a difficult hardship for someone to work when there's extreme conditions for the job. So each job has a weight. Each compensable factor has a weight that determines what the value is to the company. And then once we determine that, we can use the point system to assign points to each of those jobs. And then that enables us to be able to determine what that pay structure will be like. The nice thing about that point factor method is it gives us not just a ranking of importance, but it also tells us how much more important it is, because that's the job of the weighting. The ranking method is not a weighted method, but the point factor is. So that gives us more nuance in our ability to determine what the pay rate should be for each job. As I've said to you, the compensable factor is the dimension of the job that has some value or worth to the company, and each of those quote-unquote compensable factors will be weighted differently. The benchmark job is jobs that we know are fairly common, no matter where they are. They have certain skill sets. So a secretary or an administrator is fairly common from company to company. It doesn't really vary much from company to company. So those benchmark jobs give us a good sense of what the anchor point should be, and then we can go up or down from that anchor based on that. Along with internal equity, we have to deal with external equity, which means jobs in my company have to compare to what the marketplace will pay. So I have to make a determination: am I going to pay the same as the market? Am I going to pay less than the average market, or am I going to pay more than the average market? Now, a Walmart pays under the average market, and a innovation company, a differentiation company, will pay above the market. And so we need to determine, first of all, how those jobs, perhaps in other companies, are being paid, and then from there to be able to decide now, should we continue to pay more than what the market bears or less than what the market bears? And so we have to take into account, obviously, the amount of talent that's available, the talent availability. If it's less available, we're going to have to pay more money in order to attract them. What are the unemployment rates in the area? What about changes in technology? Because changes in technology require more skill, so we can pay people more money, but we need less people. So there's a trade-off there, right? Population shifts, expertise, all sorts of things. How easy it is to find somebody to fill those positions is really the key. And then obviously the product or services that we're making, are we differentiation? Are we cost leadership? Do we want to meet, we call lead, lag, or match the pay line for our comparative industry? So we need to know, first of all, what the comparative industry is doing, and then make a decision how we want to position ourselves pay-wise. So how do we do that? Well, we have to do market reviews. We have to do salary surveys. And there's lots of sources out there. There are some salary surveys that you pay for and some that are, there's some availability of information for you. You can go to salary.com and it gives you some rudimentary information. We have to match job descriptions and we need to know comparably what a job does. And we can use ONET, where we understand some generic job descriptions and see how we vary compared to those generic job descriptions in ONET. And the goal is, of course, to get some collected data to be able to make some decisions. Now, here's the trick, though. By the time an independent third party collects salary data, uploads and analyzes that salary data, and then shares it with people, it could be 6 months or a year. So sometimes those salary surveys are at least 6 months, if not a year, too old. So I have to take that into account when I am ready to make determinations for pay. So when you are looking at external equity, as I said, keep in mind that those surveys are older and they're probably from at least 6 months to a year before you actually get the report. And then depending on when you look at the report to make your determinations, that adds even more time. So keep in mind that there is a time lag when you are looking at your salary surveys. Second, recognize that if you have differing salary surveys from different sources, that they all weight things very differently. And then you may need to consider how to weight the data that you have. All right, and so you need to know what those weights are. And if you don't have a sense of that, then that might be a problem. So recognize that those salary surveys are going to break things down based on size of the organization, industry that they're in, and you need to look at that fine-tuned data and not just say, well, on average people make $30 an hour, so that's what I should pay. Well, if you're a large organization, you might pay more. If you're a smaller organization, you might pay less. If you're a differentiation strategy company, you'll pay more. And if you are a cost leadership company, you're going to pay less. The most important thing is it's a starting point. It is not going to give you everything that you need to know. You need to start to break the information down and look at each variable to make sure that what you're looking at is accurately representing what your company is and what it does and what it should be paid. So bringing it all together, you have to look at your internal structure, the internal equity issues, and the external equity issues. So looking at those benchmark jobs and seeing how they get paid compared to other industries externally. And that helps you to set your pay level. And then, of course, you have to take into account what the market is paying. For example, in St. Louis, it's significantly cheaper to be paid in St. Louis than it is in New York City or Chicago or LA. But St. Louis, it is more expensive than, say, Jefferson City or Branson, Missouri, right? Smaller communities. So you need to know what your market is paying and what the cost of living is in that area, because that's an important consideration as well when we're figuring out what the rate of pay should be.